For 70 years, the United States and Iran have been locked in a tangled story, one that started with friendship and somehow twisted into a bitter rivalry. This is an explainer of how two allies became such entrenched adversaries. It's a journey that takes us through a secret coup, a bloody revolution, and the long, long shadow they still cast over our world today.
You know, the hostility we see today didn't just appear out of nowhere. It has deep roots, planted in specific moments that absolutely shattered trust. And this quote, well, it gets right to the heart of it. The idea that US support for an authoritarian ruler directly fueled the anger that exploded in 1979. It was like planting seeds of fury that would just lie dormant for decades, waiting to erupt.
I mean, it's a wild transformation when you think about it. For a long time, the US was actually seen as a pretty fair dealer in Iran, a good alternative to the old colonial powers like Britain and Russia. So what happened? How did America become the Great Satan? To really get that, we have to go back to a single pivotal event in the hot summer of 1953.
A lot of historians point to the 1953 coup as the, quote, original sin of the whole US-Iran relationship. This was the exact moment Washington crossed a line, from a trusted outsider to a direct interventionist, secretly engineering the overthrow of a democratically elected leader. And in doing so, they changed the course of Iranian history forever.
It all kicked off, as these stories so often do, over oil. Back in 1951, Iran's Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh decided to nationalize the country's oil industry. This made Great Britain, which had controlled it for decades, absolutely furious. So Britain went to Washington, arguing that this was an opening for Soviet influence. At first, President Truman said no, but his successor, Dwight Eisenhower, was swayed. He gave the CIA the green light for one of its first ever covert operations, to topple a foreign government.
And right here, you see this fundamental clash of perspectives. For Mossadegh and millions of Iranians, taking control of their own oil was just a basic act of national sovereignty. It was their oil, right? But for London and Washington, it was a huge threat, not just to their economic interests, but to their whole Cold War strategy of containing communism.
The operation itself was pretty much a masterclass in secret warfare. It was led by a CIA agent named Kermit Roosevelt. Yep, Teddy Roosevelt's grandson. He showed up in Tehran with suitcases literally stuffed with cash to bribe politicians and newspaper editors, to pay agents to pose as communists and threaten religious leaders, and to basically orchestrate riots in the streets. The whole point was to create an atmosphere of total chaos, making it look like Mossadegh had lost control.
And it worked. The Shah, who'd actually fled the country, was put back on the throne. And what happened to that oil Mossadegh had nationalized? Well, it was carved up, and American companies were handed a massive 40% stake. In the short term, it looked like a huge win for US foreign policy, but it set in motion a chain of consequences that would come back to haunt America for decades.
So, with the Democratic government gone, the United States went all in, throwing its full support behind an authoritarian ruler, the Shah. This new, much closer alliance would define the next 25 years. But the Shah's total dependence on Washington would end up being his greatest weakness, and would eventually fuel his own spectacular downfall.
Now, this was way more than just an alliance. It was a deep, deep partnership. The US poured billions into Iran, seeing the Shah as a key ally against the Soviet Union. And crucially, the CIA helped create and train his secret police, SAVAK. SAVAK became a word that inspired terror. It was infamous for its prisons, where torture was routine, and for eliminating any and all political opponents. In the eyes of many Iranians, the brutality of SAVAK and the power of America were one and the same.
The Shah also tried to modernize Iran with his White Revolution. Now, on paper, the goals looked great: land reform, literacy programs, even new rights for women. But the changes were so fast and so forced from the top down that they deeply unsettled Iran's traditional religious society. The clergy lost power. Many ordinary Iranians resented what felt like a foreign assault on their values, especially since it was so closely tied to the Shah's American backers. You can only keep a lid on that kind of resentment for so long. By the late 70s, a mix of economic problems, political repression, and this cultural alienation, well, it created a revolutionary powder keg. The streets started filling up with protesters. And then, in 1978, two catastrophic events basically lit the fuse.
August 1978, arsonists set fire to the Cinema Rex movie theater, and they barred the doors from the outside. 400 people were burned alive. The public was horrified, and almost everyone blamed the Shah's secret police, SAVAK. That single massacre became this powerful symbol of the regime's evil, and it just supercharged the revolution. Just a month later, Black Friday. Protesters gathered in Tehran's Jala Square, and the security forces just opened fire on the armed crowd. Over 100 people were killed. After that, any hope for some kind of peaceful compromise was just gone. The bloodshed pushed all the moderates into the arms of the revolutionaries. There was simply no turning back.
The Shah fled Iran in January 1979. The revolution had won, but the story was nowhere near over. In fact, the ghost of 1953 was about to return in a big, big way, triggering the one event that would poison US-Iran relations for generations.
So when President Carter allowed the Shah, who was dying of cancer, to come to the US for medical treatment, it set off a firestorm of paranoia in Tehran. Revolutionaries were convinced it was a trick, a pretext for another CIA-backed coup, a complete repeat of 1953. Fearing history was literally about to repeat itself, they decided to act first.
For 444 agonizing days, 52 American diplomats and citizens were held hostage. The crisis was on the news every single night. It crippled the Carter presidency, and it left this deep, lasting wound in the American mind. The images of blindfolded Americans and burning flags, that cemented a view of Iran as this hostile, radical state. And with that, formal ties were completely broken.
But if you look at their demands, it tells you everything. Yeah, they wanted the Shah back for trial, but they also demanded something else, an apology from the US for the 1953 coup. The hostage crisis was the ultimate blowback. It was a direct, traumatic reckoning with the consequences of that American intervention 26 years earlier.
After the hostages were finally released, the relationship entered a new phase. You could call it a long Cold War. It wasn't defined by direct conflict, but by economic pressure, proxy fights, and just this profound mutual suspicion, which would all eventually come to a head over Iran's nuclear ambitions. For over 40 years, America's main weapon against Iran hasn't been a missile, it's been money. Sanctions have been the #1 tool of US policy. It started during the hostage crisis, got ramped up in the 90s, and then went global in the 2000s when the UN got involved over Iran's nuclear program. The whole goal was to squeeze Iran's economy so hard that it would be forced to change its behavior. And eventually, all that pressure did lead to talks. The result was the 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA. It was a huge diplomatic achievement. Basically, in exchange for lifting the crippling sanctions, Iran agreed to strict, verifiable limits on its nuclear program. It was designed to prevent a nuclear-armed Iran without having to resort to war.
But the deal was always controversial here in the US, and in 2018, Washington just walked away, arguing the deal didn't go far enough. The US reimposed its harshest sanctions, and the agreement pretty much collapsed. In response, Iran started enriching uranium again to higher levels, kicking the whole region back into a state of high tension.
So as we look at the conflict today, whether it's the nuclear standoff or clashes across the Middle East, you just can't disconnect it from the 70 years of history that brought us to this point. In this relationship, the past is never really past.
And this really sums up the whole story, that one covert action in 1953. It's the thread that runs through everything. It led to the Shah's repressive rule, which then fueled the anti-American rage of the 1979 revolution. That revolution led to the hostage crisis, which shattered relations and started this cycle of hostility that we're still stuck in today.
Now, none of this history excuses the actions of any government, but it does give us critical context. It shows how a single decision can echo for decades, creating these cycles of mistrust that are incredibly difficult to break. And understanding these deep, tangled roots is really the only way we can even begin to ask how the future of this relationship might ever be different from its past.